So it is my immense pleasure to welcome to the Q&A Mr. Sumantra Ghosal and Shabana Azmi, ma'am. Thank you so much for taking the time out to join me today.
Pleasure.
Now, firstly, I'd like to congratulate you both on Kaifinama. It's a very insightful documentary, and it's taught me a lot about Kaifi Saab's life. It's taught me a lot about the man behind the poet. Shabana, ma'am, I'd like to come to you first. Now, I understand that you came up with the idea of making Kaifinama to celebrate Kaifi Saab's 100th birth anniversary.
That's right, yes.
And you approached Sumantra sir for that. How did this idea come to you? How did the idea of a documentary to celebrate his life come to you?
Well, there were 100 things that we were doing to celebrate the centenary, and the most obvious of that was, of course, to document his life in a meaningful way, because although he has been interviewed a lot and there's a lot of stuff available on him on YouTube, etc., I think it was very necessary to do something that situated Kaifi within the times and within his work in a comprehensive way. And I couldn't think of anyone better than Sumantra to do it, because I'd watched a documentary that he has done of Zakir Hussain, and I was enthralled by it. I was also aware of the fact that Sumantra was interested in Urdu poetry, and that he had done a recording with my parents several years ago. And to my great surprise and pleasure, he had that recording with him. Sumantra is not the easiest person to persuade at all. We call him Dr. No, because everything that you tell him, he first says no. But to my utter surprise, he took his time, but then he said yes. And that to me was really winning the battle, because then after that, I knew that I wouldn't have to give him any inputs at all, because he's a master at what he does. And so I just placed it in his hands. The thing is, we were working with very little money, because it was being produced by the NGO that was founded by Kaifi Saab, called Mijwan Welfare Society. Yeah. And that was the only constraint that we had. But gallantly, Sumantra agreed to that. And I do believe that he's made a very fine film.
I think we can all agree to that, having seen the film. It is very fine indeed. Now, Sumantra sir, I'd like to come to yourself. What was your reaction when you were approached? What was your initial reaction when you were approached for this documentary?
Well, I think in a word, it was terror. But Shabana's memory fails her each time. I didn't take any time to say yes. I said yes immediately, partly because I knew that I would then be with Shabana and Javed for 2 years. And they have wonderful meals and great conversations. So whatever the end film was, whatever the end film may have ended up being, I knew that those 2 years were taken care of. So yes, terror because I don't know the language, I didn't know his work that well, and I'm not prolific, and therefore embarking on anything at all. And when you know that you have at the end of the road, you have judges like Shabana Azmi and Javed Akhtar, apart from others, that does strike you with a bit of terror. And you obviously have to take on the journey with huge responsibility, because you owe it to the man. The man was an outstanding man, not just a poet, but in so many ways. And in more ways than I knew at the time when I said yes. And I'm so happy to have said yes, because my journey allowed me to discover all those other sides to Kaifi Azmi, which are as extraordinary as his poets and his poetry.
Most definitely.
So it was a wonderful journey.
Most definitely. Now, staying with yourself, sir. One of the things Shabana mentioned was that you had some archival footage. And one thing I found very interesting was the making of the film itself. How did you come up with the idea of mixing interviews, archival footage, and certain recreations to tell the story of Kaifi Saab's life?
Well, we had a paucity of material. And whenever I approached Shabana asking for historical footage, photographs, material, recordings, she would shrug her shoulders in that gay abandon and with little concern for the filmmaker's plight. So I realized that I needed to make the narrative visually interesting without sometimes having the visuals that would make it interesting. So one had to invent the visuals. At the same time, I didn't feel that I wanted to, particularly because he was in the past and not somebody who is alive today, except through his work. I didn't feel that I could do recreations in color using actors and pretend that these are what it was then. Partly because we didn't have the money to pull it off, partly because it would mean a great deal more in terms of who we cast, how we go about it, what we do. So I decided that I would take this, to me, interesting route of doing recreations, which were found bits of film as far as I saw them in those in my own imagination and mind. So I thought to myself, what if I discovered a trunk, an old rusty trunk, and I opened it and I found all these little bits of footage there, some, slightly destroyed by time, by age, and others not so. What would that have been like? And therefore, I think that led me to use recreations. Not to make this very long and boring, but those recreations, I have a backstory for each of those recreations.
Right.
I mean, I know why I and where I got that footage and who I got it from, because that allowed me to then recreate it with more authenticity, even though I was lying through my teeth all along.
Now, one of the other aspects that I wanted to come to, ma'am, is the gatherings that you had that were in the house with yourself and Javed Saab and 4 or 5 others, where you're discussing Kaifi Saab's life. When I was watching that, it very much felt like a fly on the wall documentary. That was something that's very natural. Is that something that happens a lot? Do you have these gatherings where you're discussing poetry and the cinema and those sort of things, or was this something that was set up specifically for the film?
Well, we do have many such gatherings, but it was entirely Sumantra's idea, and I think it worked very well because we got together people who were familiar with the movement, progressive writers movement, and also with Kaifi's work. And rather than making it all into talking heads film, I thought that this was an extremely interesting way of setting it up. And that is entirely to Sumantra's credit. We did it in Kaifi's home in Mumbai, which is now my brother's office. And it just happened so naturally. You put the people together and it just flows.
And yeah, it did seem, like I said, it seemed very, very natural. It didn't seem
And
staged,
also,
which is why it felt.
It was something that I've seen a lot in my house ever since I was a child, because we had like-minded people and we had gatherings at home, and so this was a very sort of familiar thing for me.
Sure. Now, one of the things I understand, I think for both of you, is that you wanted poetry to be a cornerstone of this documentary. But when you have such a huge repertoire, how did you both select the poems to include within Kaifinama?
I think that is a very tough choice indeed. But I'm a very good producer in that I don't interfere with the director at all. I hope Sumantra will agree with that. And so anything he would tell me, I'd say, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And so the choice, I think, was Sumantra's entirely. And it was interesting because he's also got, मैं ये सोचकर उसके दर से उठा था, at the same, along with Makan, which is filmed so beautifully. And what that does is subliminally makes you aware that Kaifi was
We've
poet
lost.
and that in the face. I think Sumantra has managed to capture that very beautifully.
So, sir, how did you choose the poems then?
With great difficulty and a lot of ignorance. I didn't know the work in its entirety, but I knew of some of the poems because they were very famous poems.
Sure.
Like Ut Meri Jaan Mere Saathi. That is a very famous poem. And there are many such milestones. But for me, really, yeah, Makan. But for me, sorry, Aurat. But for me, really, is anything that's in the film has to thrust the narrative forward. And if it doesn't do that, then it lives brilliantly on its own, but it also detracts from an overall structure and overall thrust of narrative. And for me, that's always been very, very important to be able to keep the story interesting and going, not stop it for a brilliant facet of something or the other. So every poem actually furthers a thought and idea and connects to another one if you look at it closely. So all of that determined what I chose and how what to include and how much of it to include, because obviously you can't. They're long poems, some of them, and you can't include all the poetry
the whole thing.
in total. So
that was what surprised me a little when you said that you weren't fully aware of all of Kaifi Saab's works, because when I saw the film, it felt as though it flowed very well. It told each part of the life story, and as you say, moved the narrative forward. So I thought
Bhaskar, allow me to interrupt here. One of the reasons I thought Sumantra was the perfect choice to make this film is because I was aware that he didn't know Kaifi in his entirety. And so I wanted him to discover the man and the poet. Otherwise, Kaifi has such an overwhelming personality that it is quite easy to get weighed down by uh, his great stature and then sort of fit pieces in. Uh, because Sumantra wasn't as aware as maybe another person would, I think it's worked beautifully because he, along with the audience, discovers Kaifi as the film progresses. I think it goes very strongly in the film's favor.
And ma'am, is that something that you had almost planned for the documentary, in that you wanted the audience to discover the man that you knew?
Yes, because again, that's why my inputs weren't all that much, because my inputs, I've talked so much about my father that he's almost on autopilot for me. And I wanted that not to creep into the film at all. And मैं शुमांत्र कितनी तारीफ करूं आपकी?
Sir, can I ask?
Yeah.
No, sorry, I was just going to ask. So with ma'am has mentioned the sort of the limited budget for the film, and you've mentioned the terror that you faced when you were approached. But what were the challenges that you faced overall over the making of the film?
I think a great challenge, though, that Shabana looks on that as not being a drawback, but a great challenge was my lack of the period and of Kaifi Saab's oeuvre. I didn't know his poetry, his lyrics, and all that he'd done at all, actually, in a strong way, because it's not as if I grew up with Urdu literature. And so, and because this came with a specific deadline, it was meant for an event. It meant that I couldn't now spend the next 5 years researching, Urdu poetry, progressive writers. I had to collapse all of that homework that, of course, needed to be done. I mean, I couldn't make the film without doing that. And yet I didn't have, all the time in the world to do it. And I don't like working with research teams, nor can I afford it. So I have to do all the research myself. So all of that was what were the big challenges. And of course, then to be able to cast things like the young Kaifi reading in the Mushaira where his wife falls in love with him. Those bits of casting were very critical because he was a very handsome man. He was very handsome, riveting speaker, orator. So all these are frightening things when you don't have a casting department, a huge big casting department. I did have a casting director. But, a lot of these things get a little easier if you are doing it on a bigger scale in terms of the money, in terms of the inputs that you're putting in, whatever the film ends up looking like. But because we were working with very limited means, of course, all made up for by biryani and kebab, but there were still limited means that went into the research of the film and the actual casting and making of it. Those were the bits that were the big challenges. And, some cases one succeeded, and a few cases I don't think I did. So, luck of the draw.
Now, man, one of the things that the film talks about is Kaifi Saab as a poet and as a writer, and as somebody who actively worked for change. Can you tell us a little bit about how he was as a father, and given the artistic merit of the family, was that something he really encouraged you to get involved with, or was that more a case of he encouraged you to do whatever you wanted to do and let you get on with it?
Well, as a very there used to be these mehfils at home when you had people like Faiz Ahmad Faiz and Josh Maliha Badi and Firaq, Gorakhpuri, name them, and they were all there. And what was amazing was that they chose to stay with us and not in a five-star hotel. But so I remember being very fascinated by that when they used to have the evening mehfils and sort of looking behind the curtain to see what was the magic that was happening. And Abba would call me and say, you don't have to look from behind the curtain, come and sit right amongst us, as long as you promise not to bunk school tomorrow. So that would make me feel very adult and make me feel all right. I have a responsibility too. But I grew up in that atmosphere, and I really didn't understand Urdu, nor do I claim to be an exponent today either. But the magic of the language kept falling on my ears. And I think that's what my parents did, whether it was theater with my mother or whether it was poetry with my father. It was never something that they sat us down and asked us to follow. We just followed by example. One thing that used to flatter me a lot about my father is that inevitably I was the first person he would recite any new poem that he had written to. And novice that I was, I would take objection to a word here and a word there, and I'd say, I don't like the sound of this word. And he would change it. And I asked him one day, I said, why do you change it when you don't even know that you know that I don't know the language? So he said, it's because you don't know the language, I change it. And I said, what do you mean? Explain. And he said, you will receive it the way the reader will receive it, or the way the audience will receive it. तो अगर तुम कोई चीज खटकती है, so वो audience को खटकेगी, and that's why I changed it. So it was encouragement of that kind. I was interested in poetry. I was interested in Wordsworth and Tennyson and Keats because that's what we learned in school. But then a time came when he started taking us with him to mushairas, and that was just a very, very beautiful thing. So although we were never given homilies by our parents, we just grew up in an atmosphere that naturally nurtured the creativity in his young children.
And one of the the conversations that you refer to in the film is a conversation that you had with him about working towards change, and whether he's disappointed when the change doesn't come at that speed that you'd expect it to. Now, do you think today?
Yeah.
Sorry, ma'am. You're about to say.
No, go ahead. Go
No, I
ahead.
was just going to say. Do you think today? One of the feelings that I got watching the film is that back in those days, there was a reason for a lot of the arts, and there was a cause behind it, and a lot of what was written and a lot of what was even acted out in the plays. When you're talking about IPTA, I felt that there was a change or a cause. Do you think that is there today? And do you think that Kaifinama as a film can inspire people to maybe follow in Kaifi Saab's footsteps and actually to work for a cause?
I would hope so. I would hope so, because this wasn't Kaifi's specialty. This was the times in which he was born, when artists were committed to using art as an instrument for social change. They were coming out fresh from independence, having valued what it took to gain that independence, and there was a goal in front of them. Today, I feel it's all sort of scattered and dispersed, and we don't have artists as committed to the idea of being responsible social beings. There's a smatter of it. I mean, you have stand-up comics, and you have small books and all that, but nothing as major as a movement. That was the progressive writers movement, or as major as the movement of IPTA was. And I think we need a resurgence of that, most certainly.
Now, really, for both of you, it's been a couple of years now since Kaifinama came out. What's the reception been to Kaifinama? And one of the questions for yourself, Shabana ma'am, is the work that you showed towards the tail end of the film, the work that Mijwan does. Are there any more sort of advances in that work? Have there been any advances in the schemes that Mijwan is working towards?
Yes. Mijwa is doing very well. For one thing, we are collaborating with the University of Southampton. And Southampton is beautiful because they've really set up a scholarship program for young students who want to study rural development, with their focus being on India. And so Mijwa has been that study. And now looking at that, an Australian university has also said they're interested in that. That, for me, to become a centrifugal point from where change can actually occur is, I think, the biggest success that I can count in Mijwa. And although, it's easy to make buildings, it's easy to get a lot of infrastructure. What is difficult is to work towards transformation, so it leads to a mindset change. And what I see evident in the young girls in Mijwa is that there has been a transformation, that they have become their own people, and they know that they can be in charge of the choices they make. To me, that is the most satisfying thing that we've done in Mijma. But of course, there are miles to go before I sleep.
And Sir Sumantra, sir, have you got anything to add in terms of the reception that Kaifinama has received since it's been screened?
Well, it seems to have got pretty good reception wherever it's gone. It's won an audience award in Washington, and there seemed to be. We had people queuing up for 4 hours to see it in Mani, which is the film festival in Bombay.
Yes.
So all that sort of suggests that there is an interest, certainly, and those people seem to last the film. They don't get up and leave midway.
Sure.
And but, standing ovations after every screening.
Yeah, so it's. I think it's what one hopes for when one makes a film, because those are the rewards, really, and the rewards are are emotional more than anything else in a film like this, where people come up and say, you know, that spurred me to think about X or Y, or it's, you know, and it sparked conversations about change, about commitment, about a way of thinking. And I think when a film does that, then you feel quite, you know, chirpy about having made it.
Sure. And I think that's proof that you've really captured the essence of Kaifi Saab in the film, because what I have taken from the film is that a lot of, that is, you know, what he was about to an extent, like I say, working for a cause and working for change. Now we're running out of time, so my final question, and I'll stay with you for now, Sumantra sir. For people who have seen the film and are not familiar with the works of Kaifi Saab, what would you say would be a good place, after, of course, watching Kaifinama, a good place to start discovering the man himself?
Very tough question, because, you know, people, even though they may come and watch a film which has poems in it, there are very few people who pursue poetry, because it's not an easy section of literature that is read and can be read easily. I would suggest that if you want to know more about Kaifi Saab, then the most interesting place that I found was Shaukat Apa's book on him, his wife's book on Kaifi Saab, which was also turned into a brilliant play by Shabana and Javed. And I don't know whether that's available, but that's a superb introduction, because it's got emotion, it's got humor, wit, it has a narrative thrust, it has the highs and lows of dealing with the Communist Party, which she was quite a feisty evaluator, certainly, if not an opponent of. So I think her book, and also she looks at Kaifi Saab's life not in a docile fashion. So when she needs to defer and be annoyed, she is. And when she, and yet she gave her life for him. So it's a very interesting mix of commitment and individuality. And for me, it's a wonderful place to begin.
Ma'am, same question to you. Where would you...
See, that's very nice. The book is called Kaifi and I. It has been translated by Nasreen Rahman, published by Penguin, and it's called Yaad Ki Reh Guzar in Hindi and in Urdu, and it's really something that is worth reading. I just want to sum up what Kaifi was to me, and I think that's a very important mantra that he left behind with me, and I make mention of it in the movie, but people don't remember everything. And what I would like people to remember with is that once I had asked him that, Abba, when you're working for change, and change does not happen at the speed or the pace you want it to, do you get frustrated? And he had said, Beta, when one is working for change, one should build into that expectation that change might not occur within your lifetime. Yet you must have the belief that if you carry on working totally sincerely and with commitment, that change will occur, even if it does so after you are gone. I think that is such an invaluable message, particularly for the young who are impatient. And, you know, they want all change to be brought on a litmus paper. You put it in and it comes out and yellow. But no, when you're talking about transformation, you're talking about transformation of the mind. And that really takes a long-term commitment. And I think that's a very nice path to end it with.
I agree. I think Kaifi Saab's legacy will continue to live on. And I think that's a nice place to actually close out the Q&A today. So again, I'd like to thank you both, Shabana ma'am and Sumantra sir. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.